Hello, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today, or tonight, as the case may be. I'm Susan Harris, the editorial director of Words Without Borders, and we're delighted to present readings of the 4 poems chosen for our annual collaboration with the Academy of American Poets and their Poem a Day feature and newsletter. We're most grateful to the Academy of American Poets for this partnership and the spotlight it helps cast on poetry and translation. This year, our guest editor, the artist and translator Sawako Nakayasu, selected 4 poems from around the globe. Story, Late Summer or Early Fall, by Yoo Heekyung, translated from Korean by Stine An. Dedicated to All Living Beings Who Suffer, by Yang Li-sai, translated from Chinese by Joshua Edwards and Lynn Xu. A Violet Darkness, by Najwan Darwish, translated from Arabic by Kareem James Abu-Zeid, and Arachno-Scientific Salvation by Katrine Øgaard Jensen, woven via mistranslation of Ursula and Gerd Olsen. We'll hear each poem in the original and the English translation. I'll introduce, and each poem followed by some quick questions. Unfortunately, Yang Li-sai could not make it, but we're lucky to be joined by his translators, Joshua Edwards and Lynn Xu, who will read both the original and the translation. In addition, Yoo Heekyung will be joining us on a pre-recorded video, and Kareem will read both the original and his translation of Najwan's poem. At the end, we'll have a Q&A with your questions, which you may post here in the chat or send directly to Anna's Words Without Borders account. A few quick details before we get started. Nina will post these messages in the chat as I go. Please feel free to message Anna, meeting's main host, directly if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about Zoom. We will be recording this event and publishing this conversation on our YouTube next week, so you can revisit it there. We will be muting everyone except for our participants to ensure that we can hear them. You can still offer your reactions to what you'll hear. Please use the chat window at right to do so, and to ask any questions you'd like to have answered during our Q&A that will follow. There's also the reactions button, where you can use emoji to interact with the ceremony in the course of the evening. We will have closed captioning available during this event. To turn it on, just click the arrow next to CC on your bottom toolbar and select Show Subtitles. You'll notice on the top right of the Zoom application window, you have the option to toggle between a gallery view and a speaker view. We suggest speaker view so that you can see the main speakers at all times. Finally, we'll suggest that you sign up for our newsletter, which will keep you informed of all the excitement going on at WWB. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Kareem James Abu-Zeid, reading Najwan Darwish's poem, A Violet Darkness, and Kareem's translation of the poem to English from Arabic. Najwan Darwish is one of the foremost contemporary Arab poets. His second major collection in English translation, Exhausted on the Cross, translated by Kareem James Abu-Zeid, was published by New York Review of Books Poets in 2021, with a foreword by Raul Zarita. Exhausted on the Cross was shortlisted for the 2022 PEN Award for Poetry and Translation, the National Translation Award in Poetry, and the Derek Walcott Prize, and won the Sarah Maguire Prize. Darwish lives between Haifa and his birthplace, Jerusalem. Kareem James Abu-Zeid is an award-winning translator of authors from across the Arab world. His most recent translation is the Palestinian poet Najwan Darwish's No One Will Know You Tomorrow, Selected Poems 2014 to 2024, published by Yale in just this November. He has received the Sarah Maguire Prize, the Penn Center USA Translations Prize, Poetry Magazine's Translation Prize, a Fulbright Fellowship, and an NEA Translator Grant, among other honors, and has twice been a finalist for the PEN America Translation Prize, once in poetry and once in prose. He lives in the countryside just outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And now, Kareem.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Susan, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I am coming to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'll be reading this short poem of Violet Darkness in Arabic first, and then the English translation. عتمات بنفسجية وليس سوى أن أتبع عتمات بنفسجية فوق تربة تتشقق فيها الأساطير. أجل كان الحب زمنا وتشقق هو الآخر مثل وجه بلادنا. حستي من الناس عبور أشباحهم. A violet darkness. And all that remains for me is to follow a violet darkness on soil where myths splinter and crack. Yes, love was time, and it too splintered and cracked like the face of our country. My share of the people is the transit of their ghost. Thank you.
Thank you, Kareem. Would you like to say anything about the poem or its context?
This one is an interesting one because, of course, there's the general context of Palestine. But Najwan Darwish has many, many poems that are very specific, sort of a very specific scene and a particular moment in time. And this one obviously is not like that. It's quite, I think of it sometimes almost like an abstract painting. And on the words without, I mean, even the image of a violet darkness is a bit, let's say, undefined. So the context is that there is much less context than in many of his other poems. And on the Words Without Borders website, they published it with a very interesting image that was also kind of abstract. It was a piece of stoneware. So yeah, I think I'm not gonna venture too much into what may or may not have been behind this one.
Thanks, Kareem. Now we'll hear from Yoo Heekyung and Stine An. Yoo Heekyung is a South Korean poet, playwright, and essayist. He's the author of 10 collections of poetry and prose, including Today's Morning Vocabulary, Somewhere in the World, Stories of a Poetry Bookshop, Winter Night Rabbit Worries, Poetry and Photography, and Ogi and I. You studied creative writing at the Seoul Institute of the Arts and playwriting at the Korea National University of Arts, and debuted as a poet in 2008 when his poem won the Spring Literary Contest sponsored by the Chosun Ilbo. He is a playwright with the theater company Doc and a member of the poetry collection Jacquemin. A recipient of the Hyundai Munhak Literary Award and the Gosan New Writer Award, he lives in Seoul, where he runs the poetry bookshop and project space Wit and Cynical. Stine An is a Korean-American poet, literary translator, and performer based in Queens. Her work has appeared in Best Literary Translations 2024, Best American Experimental Writing 2018, Electric Literature, Black Warrior Review, World Literature Today, The Southern Review, and elsewhere. She holds a BA in Literature from Harvard College and an MFA in Literary Arts from Brown University. and is the recipient of fellowships and grants from the Poetry Project, the Penheim Translation Fund, Yaddo, ALTA, the Vermont Studio Center, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Her translations include Today's Morning Vocabulary by Yoo Heekyung, published by Zephyr in 2025, and Comet and Star, a story of cosmic friendship, written by the musician and composer Lee Juk, and illustrated by Lee Jin-hee, published by Enchanted Lion Books, 2024. Her debut poetry collection, Bee Dragon Suite, is a winner of the 2023 Night Boat Poetry Prize. Stine.
Words Without Borders에 초대를 받아서 진심으로 기쁘고요. 오늘 제가 읽어드릴 시는 저의 시집 겨울밤 토끼 걱정 속 이야기 늦여름 아니면 추가을이라는 시입니다. 이야기 늦여름 아니면 추가을. 유희경. 늦여름 아니면 추가을. 기억은 믿을 수 없다. 아버지는 모로 누워 계셨다. 한들거리는 거미줄. 거미는 보이지 않았다. 거미는 숨어 있단다. 거미줄을 건드려 보렴. 하지만 나는 무섭다. 마루가 삐걱거리는 소리. 수십 년째 말라가면서 아버지는 돌아 누웠다. 그럴 때의 냄새, 그럴 때의 온기. 거미줄을 건드리지 않은 것처럼 아버지의 등에도 손을 댈 수가 없었다. 그러니 거미도 아버지도 움직이지 않았다. 비어있을 거라는 가정은 어째서 하지 않았던 것일까? 보이지 않으면 숨어 있는 것일까? 엉금엉금 기어 문 쪽으로 달아나는 그림자. 문 아래 틈으로 밀어 넣었다가 거두는 빛의 손. 잡아야지. 도망칠 수 없도록. 늦여름 아니면 초가을의 기억은 믿을 수가 없어. 나는 아직도 무섭고.
Hi everyone, my name is Stine and I'm joining from Queens. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction, and thanks to Words Without Borders for having me be a part of this reading. Story, Late Summer or Early Fall by Yoo Heekyung. Late summer or early fall, memories are unreliable. Father was lying on his side. In the swaying spider web, no spider could be seen. The spider is hiding. Why don't you try touching the spider web? But I am afraid. The sound of wooden floorboards creaking. Withering up for decades, father rolled over to his other side, and when he did, his scent, his warmth. Just as I hadn't touched the spider web, I didn't dare touch my father's back. And so neither the spider nor my father moved. Why couldn't I grasp that the space would be empty? If you can't see it, is it hiding? The shadow that creeps and crawls toward the door to escape, the light that casts and gathers the shadow under the gap. I'll grab its hand so it won't run away. Memories of late summer or early fall are unreliable, and I am still afraid.
Thank you, Stine. Would you like to tell us anything about the poem or about its context?
Sure. One note I want to mention is you made the recording in the poetry bookshop that he runs, Wit and Cynical in Seoul. So if anyone's ever in Seoul, I highly recommend visiting. It's a bookstore dedicated to poetry. And with this poem, it's about presence and absence, and the speaker is remembering, connecting with their father, their dead father, through memory. And And when I was translating this poem, I was really touched by the tenderness and delicacy of feeling. And this is from a poem from a collection about stories. And so I think you have spoken about uh, the story of the poem and what is made possible in the space of a poem. And while I was translating this, the most challenging thing or difficult thing was deciding whether or not to keep the absence of punctuation, because in the Korean, the poet very purposely left out periods. And in my initial draft, I had included the periods, but then when we discussed the translation together, he actually insisted that I try translating without it as a way to kind of keep things flowing together or kind of being layered on top of each other, kind of like a spider web.
Wonderful. And I love the analogy with the spider web and the layering. Thank you, Stine. So you collaborated with the poet.
Yes, for this particular one, for this particular poem, because it would be in Words Without Borders and also for a poem a day, I wanted to do a good job. And it was such a pleasure to work with you, and he was so generous in his collaboration with me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stine. Now we'll turn to Young-Lee Tsai, Joshua Edwards, and Lynn Xu. Young-Lee Tsai, born in Panjin, China, is a poet, sound artist, and activist. He is the author of P Poems, published by Circumference Books in 2022, and was awarded the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Fellowship. He lives in Beijing. Joshua Edwards is the author of several titles, including The Double Lamp of Solitude, published by Rising Tide Projects in 2022, and Castles and Islands, from Lang Editions, 2016. He has been awarded the Académie Schloss Solitude and the Wallace Stegner Fellowships, and lives in Paris. Lynn Xu is the author of And Those Ashen Heaps That Cantilevered Vase of Moonlight, Wave Books, 2022, and Debts and Lessons, published by Omnidan, 2013, which was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. She teaches at Columbia University and is an editor at Canarium Books. She lives between New York City and Marfa, Texas. Joshua and Lynn?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, especially to Susan and Anna and to everybody at Words Without Borders and the Academy of American Poets, and to Sawako Nakayasu especially, and Yang for writing this poem. I think Lynn's going to read the original first, and then I'll follow with the translation.
And you can, of course, go on the Words Without Borders website and the Poem-a-Day website to hear Yang read it. I mean, he reads it very, very well. So I'm gonna read it, but you should go and listen to him read it too. And also to thank our fellow translators and readers. So thank you guys for doing the work that you do. Okay. 献给困难中的众生。一。不，在真相的背后还有真相。二，雨在大地上作画，用工笔细细描绘在那些遮蔽物，山、林、郭、河、鹤、建筑、车辆、人。走兽、飞禽、爬虫，使其渐渐显出轮廓，从隐形到显象，从固态到变化。这是某种形式的正义吗？雨和雨的描绘。遮蔽和遮蔽的隐形与变化，这就如同痛者 以眼泪描摹猎者、虐者、窃者、快者和仁者。痛者以眼泪、工笔刷洗丝丝之痛，磅礴之痛，细密之痛，锥心之痛，气血之痛，裂骨之痛，凌迟之痛，失魂之痛。要多少眼泪，才能令他者居一抔同情之泪？痛是生者已死的辩解，雨是天壤之北辰，而这一切皆归于水。
Dedicated to all human beings who suffer. No, behind the truth are other truths. Rain makes a painting on the earth in the classical manner, meticulously depicting what's hidden from view. Mountain, forest, valley, gorge, building, vehicle, person, beasts, cattle, creeping things, and flying fowl, gradually expressing the outline from invisible to visible, from solid state to a state of change. Is this a form of justice, rain, and representations of rain, shrouds and the shroud's ability to obscure and to change? This is like one who suffers, crying to describe the hunter, the torturer, the thief, the grifter, and the assassin. The one who suffers uses tears and exacting brushstrokes to scrub away the silk threads of pain, endless sorrow, sharp anguish, heartache, bloodletting grief, pain of breaking bone, pain of 1,000 cuts, pain of losing one's soul. How many tears are needed to provoke another's tears of sympathy? Pain forms the boundary between life and death. Rain is another name for heaven and earth. All in the end is water.
Thank you, Lynn and Joshua. Would you like to say anything about the poem and about your translation?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll give a little bit of context that I've talked about with Yang. So this is a poem that he wrote after watching the news, basically. He is a Zen novice now, so most of his time is spent in meditation or working at the monastery. But it is a socially engaged monastery, and so he is still very much paying attention to what's going on in the world. And I know that this was specifically written after being confronted with a newspaper or something that brought him news of the world that was very troubling. I think it was the war and a few different things that kind of came together and made him want to write a poem for the beings who suffer, not just human beings. I think I read one of the old titles that somebody had published, but yeah. And so for this poem, we also were able to talk to him about the poem, which we weren't able to do when we published or when we translated his book because he was not available. So this was really great because we were able to kind of talk to him about poetry as we were translating. And yeah, so that's kind of the context, I guess.
Very good. And again, obviously, this translation is also a collaboration between the two of you. How did you work, or what was your method on this particular poem? Did it follow your usual practice, or I think people are always curious about collaborative translations.
Collaboration, we're married, we share life together, we have little kids running around. I think this, we always want to have collaborations. We work really poorly together, and building a life, good, but actually poetic projects, not really good. But this, we're translating our friend's work, and it is about, I think, friendship, and then you know, sort of working together in the small hours where we can do it and find time to do it together, between the tantrums and the you know, all the stuff. So I think it is infused with life, and a lived reality. And also, you know, I speak Chinese, so it's a necessary component. But I think you know, Josh is a great translator. I think that this is a great kind of there's a person coming. Okay, but so I think that it's also kind of an interesting way for me to move into the sort of kind of metabolism of thinking about translation with him. It's been great. I've learned a lot.
I think on my side, I'll just say quickly that I think, you know, one of my things I do is I'm a builder, and like Lynn does all the rough carpentry. She puts up the walls of the translation and everything, and I do the not literally. When we build, I do all that stuff, but yeah, I do like in the poem, she does the rough building and the main kind of heavy lifting, and I do like the cabinetry and the fine, you know, the woodwork and things like that. And I ask the questions like, maybe shouldn't we have a window there, or, you know, shouldn't the door open inward instead of outward, or some things like that. So yeah.
Yes. And lovely to see this new collaboration. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Now we'll turn to Katrine Øgaard Jensen. Katrine Øgaard Jensen is the author of Ancient Algorithms, published by Saraband Books this year, a collaborative book of poems with Baba Baji, C.A. Conrad, Paul Cunningham, Aditi Mikado, Sawako Nakayasu, and Ursula Andkjær Jr. Olsen. Øgaard Jensen's translations include My Jewel Box, published by Action Books 2022, also by Andkjær Olsen. A recipient of several fellowships and awards, including the National Translation Award in Poetry, she lives in Kingston, New York. Katrine.
Thank you so much, Susan and Sohini and Anna and Nina and Eleanor at Words Without Borders. Thanks for all the work that you put into this event and to the publications, and thanks to the Academy of American Poets, and extra thanks to Sawako, of course, for curating these amazing poems, and thanks to all the readers. I get to say that now as the last reader. Thanks so much to my fellow readers. Those were amazing poems and translations. So I'll do my best to end this. So I'll be reading a poem that is actually a mistranslation of Ursula Andkjær Olsen's entire trilogy of poems, consisting of Third Millennium Heart and Outgoing Vessel and My Jewel Box, all published by Action Books. And this is a mistranslation through a game of online spider solitaire. Arachnoscientific salvation. At all times, a sensation of intricate webs, soft, possibly smooth, and heavy. Life does not mean the same to them as it does to us. I lie on their sweat embroidery. I'm allowed to be upset here, fully plugged in, glistening and inaccessible. I eat everything, and I am everything. A garden of marble between ornamented walls. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrine. We've been talking about collaborations, and your poem is an unusual sort of collaboration in that you're working with another text, and a text, obviously, that you have, a text by an author who you have translated, her work that you have translated as well.
Mm-hmm.
How did this poem come about? What prompted you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the poem is part of a longer work titled Ancient Algorithms. And in that book, I rewrite or mistranslate my English translation of Olsen's poetry, either by myself or with other poet translators that you mentioned in your introduction, including Sawako, who chose the poems for this this curated series. So each poem in the book is prefaced by a set of rules that dictate how to rewrite Olsen's poetry. So the rules include stuff like, asking Scandinavian runes how to remix a poem, or taking a poem on a virtual tour of a Danish castle where the crown jewels are located, and rules like that. So the poem that I read today, Arachnoscientific Salvation, is from a section of the book titled Games for Poet Translators. So there's different translation games with different rules, and then the result of those rules. And I can briefly read you the rules that preface this poem so you can get a sense of how it's structured in the book. So here are the rules for this particular poem. 1. Start a game of online spider solitaire. 2. Assign a book of poetry to 3 of the 4 suits. The last suit should be assigned to your own imagination. I picked my English translations of Ursula N. K. Olsen's trilogy. So spades was Third Millennium Heart, clubs was Outgoing Vessel, hearts was My Jewel Box, and then diamonds was Dealer's Choice, meaning my own imagination. 3, for each card facing up, take the book matching its suit and turn the number of pages on the card. Upon reaching a page, pick 1 or 2 lines that emit spider energy and weave the text into a new poem. Continue this process with each upward-facing card until all are incorporated into your new creation. So those were the rules that led to this poem.
This must have been so much fun.
It really was. Yeah. It was kind of a book that came out of a fatigue with trauma mining and trying to write based on, my own egotistical experience all the time. So it was more of opening up to having fun and seeing, poetry as, a lot more than just what's in my interior, but also, sort of coming together to create something new. Yeah.
And a wonderful example of taking an Oulipo approach.
Yes.
We were also struck by the fact that of the 4 poems, 2 involve spiders. So we really had a mini theme waiting to be smoked out there. Okay, thank you, Katrine. We're ready to start the Q&A. Again, we I think have any number of questions to look at. Before we start, do the readers have any questions for each other?
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, please.
I wanted to know how you find the person you translate, that, how you find that one. I mean, many, but how do you do it?
I can take a stab at that one. The poem I read was by Najwan Darwish, and we've done 3 books, so I kind of consider him sort of my lifetime poet. I don't have time to do, a whole bunch of projects, so I have to pick and choose. But he was invited to a literary festival, a poetry festival in San Francisco when I was living there, and they had asked me to translate the Arabic language poets at the festival, and we got along quite well. Now he's one of my closest friends. This is maybe 12 years later, 14 years later, 12, I think. And so it was kind of a happy chance, I guess. And then after the festival, I kept translating some of his poems, and then we submitted them to journals and stuff. And then sort of a happy coincidence led to the first book coming out with NYRB Poets. And then, but I think of it as synchronicity, or sometimes it just clicks really well with some authors, and other times it doesn't click so well. But in that case, it clicked, and it has continued clicking.
Katrine, how about you?
Well, the poet that I've translated the most is Ursula N. K. Olsen, that I'm now also mistranslating, also with Ursula N. K. Olsen. So it's she's in on it. She's in on the joke. And I guess for me it was I've always been fascinated by her poetry, and I went to see her read once in Denmark before I even got into writing literature of my own. And I was just completely mesmerized by her performance of poetry. She's also a performance artist like Stine, and she's just so I don't know, like I fell in love with the person and the delivery of the poetry first and foremost, and then when I was invited to translate a book of hers, I jumped at the opportunity, and we have not looked back ever since. Yeah. And I'm glad to say that also her personality very much matches how great her poetry is. She's an incredible person. So I love that Kareem is translating his best friend. I feel similarly. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll move on to the Q&A.
I would love to share how I met.
I beg your pardon, Stine. I'm so
no,
sorry.
right. No, I was muted. But I love that there's a theme to this evening, and it is collaboration. And I was able to meet Poet You through a collaboration between poets and translators. I was taking a translation workshop during my MFA program at Brown, taught by Sawako Nakayasu, and I didn't know too much about contemporary South Korean poetry, and I asked her. And at the time, she was working on the collaborative translation of Isang from Wave Books with Sawako, Dami Che, Jack Jung, and also Joelle McSweeney. And so she reached out to Dami, and then she was like, Dami, I have a student who's like looking for a contemporary poet. Is there anyone that comes to mind? And I think Dami, through Kim Hoon, had met Yoo Heekyung, who is one of the former students of Kim Hoon. And so Dami sent me his contact information. She said he's a playwright, and he runs a poetry bookshop in Seoul. Like, maybe you can check out either his plays or his poems and see if anything interests you. And for me, I ended up translating his debut poetry collection, Today's Morning Vocabulary, that came out in 2011, because I was also an emerging poet at the time, and I was really interested in translating the work of a poet when he was emerging. And I really admired his work with the poetry bookshop, because he had such a welcoming approach to poetry, and in a lot of the interviews, he mentioned that he wanted to make poetry accessible for a wider audience, that if you're someone who can enjoy music or wine, there's poetry that you'll also like. And that if you read a book of poems, if you walk away with one or two lines that you really love, that's enough. And so for me, as someone who is studying poetry and who's really excited to write poetry, similar with Katrine, I think I was really interested in the person, and that also inspired me to translate his work. And the wonderful thing is, since I started translating his work, I now have a deeper relationship to the Korean language, and also I've had the chance to become friends with contemporary South Korean poets, including you. And this past summer, we were able to do a reading together at his bookshop. So I think for me, that is this wonderful thing about literary translation, is the collaboration between poets and translators, and between other poets.
His bookshop sounds absolutely inspiring.
It's one of my favorite places. Mm-hmm.
That's great. Josh and Lynn, how did you come to your poet?
I was a fellow at the same time as Yang at a residency in Germany. And Lynn hadn't arrived quite yet whenever I had arrived, but there was this, and at the time we didn't know he was a poet. But once Lynn arrived, he was very excited because she was the only other person there who spoke Chinese, and his English is okay. Um, but uh, but yeah, we became fast friends, and actually, this is a kind of a interesting part of the story. So that was how we met, and then later we found out that he wrote poems. He gave us his manuscript, and that was years later. But before that, when we lived in China, we had gone to Beijing, and we there's a big art area there, and
798.
798, which is now like all blue chip galleries and stuff. But it used to be a lot of DIY spaces. And when we went there, his was one of the last remaining DIY spaces. We didn't know him yet. This was years before we met him at the residency, and we had gone to his space, and we heard a voice he ran like a record store essentially for experimental music, and performance and various things, and listening space, yeah. But it was also a store, and he lived up in a loft. And yeah, so we met him at a distance and heard his voice, and he called down to us, and then we remembered years later, oh yeah, we went to Sugar Jar, your store, and we remember your voice. So yeah, it is a small world kind of thing, and now he's one of our best friends as well. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I knew you had mentioned earlier that you were translating the work of a friend, and I wasn't sure if the friendship predated the translation relationship or vice versa, but that's lovely. Again, remember, you can all, those of you in the audience, please feel free to add your questions in the chat. We have one very timely question, which from Margaret, who asks, did any of you, or have you ever dropped the original text into AI or Google Translate and seen what came out at the other end, and how that compared with your work? Obviously, we know there's no comparison, but what did you notice? If you'd done that, what did you notice? Kareem, you have a big smile.
Well, I mean, I've been doing so much of it now for a long time as a professional translator. So I was also translating academic texts and other texts, also from French and German. And I've used AI. There's programs where you can kind of have the original and then a machine translation, and then you can edit the machine translation. And I have found that sometimes very useful for prose. I still have my dictionaries there, but it works. Generally speaking, I found it worked much better for French, and to a lesser extent with German than for Arabic. And then with poetry, it's really hard because, like in the poem I read, there's a verb in Arabic that's repeated. It was a very short poem. You kind of blink and you've missed it. And there's one verb in the Arabic that was repeated, which is, this is just to give an example of where I don't feel like AI or these things really can capture. There's a verb, tashakkaka, and then it's used in the present tense, tatashakkaku, and in the past tense, tashakkaka. And it means something like cracked, but the sound obviously is very important. And then it's a verb form in the Arabic that is often used as, we'd call it maybe an intensifier. So it's not just cracked, it's a very intense form of cracking. There's another way to just say cracked. So I expanded that in the English and went with splintered and cracked, and then that got repeated because it was there twice. So things like that are often come out they come out very flat, I'd say, in machine translation. And then there's other things that come out kind of unintelligibly, like the title in Arabic is actually a plural, darknesses, but it's very natural in Arabic to say something like that, whereas in English we would never say violet darknesses, and I didn't like the sound even just on a phonic level. So I made that singular. But there's many instances like that where a machine translation will, I think, they'll get the dictionary meaning right, but it just doesn't come out well in English.
We have an interesting.
Can I actually add to that? Because I have.
Please, Katrine.
Yeah, I just want to say that Outgoing Vessel by Ursula Ann K. Olsen uses Google Translate, which I then had to translate, like pretend like I was Google Translate and translate it into English. So like it's a really hard book about grief. But then Ursula found that as she was writing this book, it came out very, very hard, like hammer-like. And so in order to soften up the poetry and make it a little more silly, she ends each section of the book with a Google translated poem that takes her like really sad, hard poems and just makes them like super crazy and like opens them up. And so I had to pretend to be Google Translate in order to translate this book, which was a lot of fun. And then we have actually continued this silly Google Translate practice in Ancient Algorithms, where we mistranslate Ursula's work. So we've done a bunch of poems back and forth where we come up with different rules for making the poems like more insane through technology. So.
So you have your work with Ursula has involved many levels and many repeated varieties of mistranslation. Then
yes, it has evolved rapidly over a decade. Yeah, it has escalated. Some would say.
That's wonderful. Stine, have you checked any of yours? Or checked. I'm sorry, that suggests that we're turning to Google Translate as an authoritative. Sorry about that.
No worries. When I translate, if there's a line that I'm really stuck with and I don't have another Korean language translator to ask questions, I will use there's a machine translation tool called Papago for Korean. I'll use that just to get additional ideas or other options that I can use. So I find it useful it's like another way to collaborate on translation. Yeah.
We have an interesting question from another audience member. I think all of you have been working with your poets for some time, and all of you have translated not only individual poems but books. How has your translation practice evolved or changed over the years years or longer that you've been working with your poet? Joshua and Lynn, how about you?
Well, I guess kind of as I guess I hinted at, or when we translated Young's book, his first book, Pea Poems, he was detained, and so he had given it to us. And we started translating it, sort of like a little here and a little there, and so, but then shortly after that, he became unavailable. And so we did the whole book while he was detained, and he was released about the same time the book was. And so with him, it's been great to be able to talk to him and even see him regularly. Yeah, we have Zoom meetings, and now his poems are very different. Like Pea Poems is it's like a completely different poet in a lot of ways. And now we're translating a book called Temple Speak, which is its foundation is in his Buddhist practice. And so there's a lot of working through questions of both classical references, but then also like I guess theological or eschatological or spiritual questions. And so that's like a very different part of the brain that gets engaged and one's relationship to poetry too. So yeah, it's been really interesting.
But it's cool because Young is so playful, right? I mean, I think it's interesting talking to him, and we'll say, "Do you like this?" And he'll like the really crazy one. He's just like, "Oh yeah, he'll like the Google Translate." Sometimes he'll be like,
Yeah.
"That's so like the way that." I think that the thing with poetry, I think Kareem was saying, is you have to sort of rewrite the poem again. It's not, it doesn't really work the way to do a one-to-one with Google. But I think so you can use it, and I think we do definitely like use it to sort of see the sort of broad strokes, but then you really have to rewrite it because it doesn't work.
Especially because AI is not developing in the direction of, a Zen Buddhist poet who speaks, Chinese. It's kind of going the opposite direction, really. So, yeah. So and also Chinese is really hard to, there's so many references, obviously, in poetry and in language in general, that it's like you really have to interrogate every phrase and sort of trying to figure out, maybe there's like a Shakespearean phrase which would kind of map onto that better than some other kind of allusion to classical Chinese or something. So, or maybe it's like a really arcane Buddhist reference. Yeah, so it's gotten more difficult too, right? It's like and funner and more difficult, and we're very happy that now it's like the conversation includes his voice, and it's a way for us to like have an excuse to kind of get onto Zoom and talk to him. So,
Kareem, how has your practice with in regards to Najwan's work changed over time?
I think it's gotten a bit more intuitive. There's kind of I feel like almost like an attunement or something that has begun to happen over the years. Because at this point, I've probably done like 1,000 pages of his poetry. Not all of those have been published, but for the selected poems, we had 600 pages that we then brought down into a book. So it feels. We move more quickly, which is nice, but then Najwan's English is excellent, and he has his poetic sensitivity in English is also very developed. So there's always the very end, maybe not the very end, that before we publish something, there's almost always, at least before we publish it in a book, and often before we publish it in a journal, we'll have a discussion about the translation beyond my initial questions. And at that point, often he makes suggestions or asks, what about this? And many times, not always, but many times that will change. There are small changes, but many of his poems are quite short. So even a couple words can make a big difference. So that'll often lead to changes to the text. And sometimes he always does it the last minute, which was much to the frustration of the editors of our recent book. And thankfully they allowed the changes, but we had something like, there was about half the book that he had not had time to really talk to me about. And so we wound up with like 300 changes after the proofs had already been made. And thankfully they were accommodating. So I'll say a shout out to Yale for allowing that. But somehow Najwan he knows what the deadline actually is, even if I tell him it's 2 months earlier, and then he pops up and does it just in time. So
Every book publisher in the audience is fainting
yes.
at this point. Stine, how has your practice changed?
That's an interesting question because you as the first poet, today's morning vocabulary. Translating you was my first experience as a literary translator. I started translating his work maybe four years ago when I was doing the MFA program at Brown. One very concrete thing is I'm now more comfortable writing business emails in Korean. Because I came to the United States when I was 2 years old, and I, spoke Korean at home, but I really had no reason to write business emails in Korean. or write emails in Korean out, to people outside of my immediate family. But through email exchanges with you, yeah, I feel more comfortable just like writing and expressing myself in Korean. And through you, because he runs this poetry bookshop, and he's also a part of an experimental theater collective and also a poetry collective. It's been a wonderful way to get to know the contemporary South Korean poetry scene in the same way that as a poet here in the States, I know about these poetic lineages or these friendships or relationships between poets. I can now learn about those lineages or relationships, or these poetic traditions in South Korea, and that's been really lovely. And I think I'm less scared to collaborate on translations. I think I've really realized how collaborative literary translation is, and I've been, I guess, lucky to find it very joyful to collaborate with you on my translations of his poems. And it's been really great to have conversations about poetics and poetry in Korean. And one other big thing is I mentioned that we did a reading together at Wit and Cynical this past summer. And as a part of that, he actually invited me to translate my own poems into Korean and to read them for a Korean audience. Yeah, and I had never considered that I would translate my own poems into Korean. He helped me translate them. That was a really lovely experience as well. And yeah, it's been really life-changing.
That's wonderful. Well, I think we could probably go for another hour or two, but we are unhappily out of time. So I want to say that we have one more question that I think would be useful to answer, which is, so someone has asked how do translators get started? And I will answer that by saying one way is to send your translations to journals in literary translation. And of course, the first one that comes to mind would be Words Without Borders. We're closed for submissions at this point, but please, we'll be reopening in March. Any of you who are fledgling translators, please keep us in mind. And in the meantime, you have many other options. Thank you to all of our readers, Katrine, Kareem, Joshua, Lynn, Stine. It's been a wonderful event. Thanks to all of you for joining us. A final reminder, you can visit our website daily at wordswithoutborders.org for the latest in writing from all around the world. To stay abreast of all things WWB, please sign up for our newsletter at the link in the chat. We'll send you an email in the coming days with a link to rewatch this event. Coming up at the end of February, Words Without Borders Campus, our education program, will be introducing its latest unit of free teaching resources. This one will focus on contemporary Caribbean literature from our archives. Please stay tuned for more information about a public event featuring many of the writers and translators whose work is included in the unit. And of course, please come to Words Without Borders to read all of these translations, to read other translations by Katrine and Kareem, and just to immerse yourselves in the world of poetry that you can find in our pages. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Good day.
Thank you.